Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. Welcome to the Authors in Conversation panel featuring the 2023 Minnesota Book Awards finalists for the competitive Emilie Buchwald Award for Minnesota Nonfiction. The Minnesota Book Awards is a program of the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library in the organization's capacity as the Minnesota Center for the Book. This year's book awards are sponsored by Education Minnesota. My name is Hampton Smith. For 30 years or more, I was a librarian and archivist at the Minnesota Historical Society. I'm also author of two books, A Brother of Mine, The Letters of William and Thomas Christie, and Confluence, A History of Fort Snelling, which was last year's Buchwald Award winner, which is one of the reasons I'm here today. As we get started, we would like to take a moment to acknowledge the Dakota people, indigenous keepers of the land on which most of us on this panel are participating today. Prior to the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux signed with the United States in 1851, this was the ancestral homeland of the Dakota, and it remains sacred to them today. We also acknowledge the Ojibwe people, fellow indigenous inhabitants of this land. The Dakota and Ojibwe people are the original stewards of the story of this place we now call Minnesota. The Friends of the St. Paul Public Library, organizers of the Minnesota Book Awards, honor this tradition and the knowledge and values embedded in it, as we all work together to lift up storytellers in our state. For this latest installment of the Minnesota Book Awards popular Meet the Finalists series, I'm pleased to be joined by Lansing Shepard, Don Luce, Barbara Coffin, Gwen Schagrin, authors of A Natural Curiosity, The Story of the Bell Museum, published by the University of Minnesota Press. Virginia M. Wright-Peterson, author of Rochester, an Urban Biography, published by Minnesota Historical Society Press. Will Steger, Rita May Steger, and Beth Dooley, authors of Steger Homestead's Kitchen, Simple Recipes of Abundant Life. Beth will be representing all of them here today, published by the University of Minnesota Press. Karen E. Cooper, author of When Minnehaha Flowed with Whiskey, A Spirited History of the Falls, published by Minnesota Historical Society Press. Congratulations to each of you for the MNBA finalist nod. I've been in your shoes and I know how exciting it is. In the interest of making the most of our short time together, I'm going to begin with a round robin question that I'd like each of you to respond to in turn. I'll then have a question or questions specific to each of you for your wonderful finalist book. The overall question or round robin question that I have for you is, what ideas, concepts, or information should readers derive from your book? And we will start with the folks from the Bell Museum.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Don Luce, and I'll take that question. And when you look at our book, you'll see a series of stories, and there's stories about scientists who are making new discoveries about how nature works. There's stories about graduate students who are learning to be scientists and they're working in various locales around the world. There are stories about university students who've come to the museum maybe for a class or for a job and have ended up really altering their careers. And of course, there are stories about artists and educators who are exploring new ways to communicate with the public. And I think one of the sort of unusual things about the Bell Museum as an institution is it brings these people who are coming from with different skills and different backgrounds together. And they have over time sort of focused on this mission of trying to improve our understanding of the natural world and promoting an appreciation and preservation of this natural diversity and try to preserve that for future generations. And so I think one of the takeaways, I hope, from this book is that people see how this integration of artists, scientists, educators have led to some really significant innovations over time. And just a couple examples. For example, the dioramas. Here we have this little museum sitting in the middle of the continent. Why should it have some of the best dioramas in the world? And so if you look at the early 20th century, and you see people like T.S. Roberts coming together with his scientific expertise, with people like Walter Breckenridge, who has this passion for education, passion for conservation, and working with the Francis Lee Jacques, who with his extraordinary artistic ability. And they come together to create these really remarkable creations, these dioramas that have helped transform museums from being display cases of specimens to places where visitors can come and get this a vision of how plants and animals are part of this living integrated ecosystem. And that, made this tremendous difference in how we perceive nature. And so that's one example. Another might be the Touch and See Room, where, in the early 1960s, the artist and the educator, Richard Bartholomew, he recognized that the museum was not really addressing the needs of young children. And so he worked with researchers at the university in child development and came up with this a way of using real objects from nature to stimulate curiosity and wonder in young children, and producing one of the first hands-on discovery rooms in the nation. And so I guess, this, I have to admit, sometimes it's probably not easy to get artists and scientists and educators to work together. But I hope one of the takeaways from the book would be that encouraging institutions, places to try this and to try to bring these people together, because you can get some really great innovation coming out of that.
Thank you. That's great. Karen, could you continue?
Can you restate the question, please?
Oh, sure. What ideas, concepts, or information should readers derive from your book?
There's a few kind of meta ideas, I think. One is that history slips away very quickly. Things get forgotten. With every death, there's a lot that's lost. And so there's no one left alive who knows the rowdy history of Minnehaha Falls. It was all forgotten, sunk into the swamp of yesterday's news. And yeah, it was a great surprise to me to discover that this past had even existed. I think too that there's something to be learned about that discovery process, in that when people die, they become, I think we all do this, we sort of apply to them the sainted halo of death, I call it, that we wash away their flaws and their failings, and we see them as just being kind of revered, now lost to us people. And what I learned in my book, and which I would like people to take away too, is this idea that the people in the past were just as flawed as we are, just as craven, just as difficult, just as imperfect, funny, and for them to feel like real people, I think, was one of the great gifts to me of the research, and I hope my readers take that too. Yeah, I think that's about it.
Okay, great. Beth, Dooley, could you continue too?
Yeah, first of all, I want to say I'm so honored to be among all of you. And second, I want to acknowledge the fact that, I'm a co-author of this book that is an intimate conversation really between Will Steger and Rita Mae Steger, who's his niece, his brother's daughter. And, we approached this book to help explain to people how intimate connecting with nature really is. And the book plays off themes of hospitality, really radical hospitality, to share with people Will's understanding of how rich our natural resources are and how much we have to share with each other. And so most people think of Will of this awesome sort of heroic, testosterone driven explorer, and he is, but he's also a big-hearted, very warm, welcoming person who wants to share what he has discovered, mostly around climate change. I mean, he was the first explorer to really witness firsthand how devastating the changes in our climates are to our natural world. And so in Ely, Minnesota, he has created, and he began this project when he was all of 21 years old, to build a center out in the woods and create a homestead. And so the idea is that you can homestead in the middle of the Twin Cities when you acknowledge those values and live from them. And so he shares his insights with that. And what was really exciting to me about that is that it's one generation to the next, because Rita May, his niece, is lovely, an incredible cook. Her recipes are fabulous. So we worked together to bring those and Will's story of hospitality to the page.
Last but not least, Virginia Wright-Peterson.
Yes, I would say that I would like people to realize that there's a lot more to the history of Rochester, Minnesota than the Mayo Clinic. That's an amazing and wonderful story, but sometimes when there's a real dominant, wonderful story like that, it ends up covering up or masking a lot of other stories that end up being hidden. And often this will include stories of women, stories of people of color, other real exciting innovations and transformations. So I'm hoping it'll convince people not only about Rochester, but maybe in wherever they're from, that or in organizations where there's one dominant history that everybody repeats. That's great. But we need to look deeper, and we also need to recognize perhaps our own role in that, in making that history. And that's the other thing I am trying to convince people to take a look at, what you have done, are doing, what your family's role is in a community or in an organization, and how that becomes our history.
That's great. Thank you. Now to go from the overall to the specific, starting with the Bell Museum folks. And one of the things I appreciated about your book was the way it works both as a narrative history and as a series of shorter vignettes. Yet it seems to have a consistent voice throughout. The reader can take it in all at once or browse from topic to topic. Given the number of authors, how were you able to maintain consistency of style throughout the work?
Well, the story of how we worked together to create a unified voice is also the story of how this book came to be and the nearly 8 years it took from inception to completion. In 2014, we finally got funding after years of struggle, which we detail in our book, to go ahead and start the new building. And suddenly, after being in our old museum since 1940, we had to start thinking about cleaning it out. And this seemed the right time to document the museum's history. And I sat down and I wrote out a list of about 100 things that I thought were important. Barb became the project manager, and she was instrumental in leading our successful grants from the Minnesota Historical Society to help fund the writing and research of the book. Don was on board, but he was very busy with planning the diorama move and the design of the new building exhibits. And so much material surfaced from our search of basement nooks and crannies and staff offices as we're cleaning out for the move, that we hired then student Dan Belden to help organize and document what eventually became, around 200 or more boxes of materials that we sent to the University of Minnesota dioramas. It was quite overwhelming. In our lead up to starting to write, I compiled a 30-page annotated bibliography, and I also made a comprehensive listing of the contents of the museum's newsletter called Imprint, which had 106 issues published between 1984 and 2015. And Lansing came on board in 2016, though he was not unfamiliar to any of us because we had all worked together before. And he's going to take over from here.
Thanks, Gwen. When Barb hired me, it was thought that this was going to be a simple project. It's going to be pretty straightforward. It was going to probably take 2 years. And the process was that I would be crafting the stories from material that Barb and Dan and Gwen would be feeding me, plus the interviews that I would do with past and present scientific staff and past and present staff on the public side of the museum. It didn't take long for us to figure out that we were extremely naive, and that the challenge that we had taken on was far greater than we had allowed time for or personnel. Basically, we're talking about a stretch of time that runs from the closing of the American frontier and the science that was known then, and all the way through the great advancements in biology and great advancements in chemistry and physics, and the rise of fields like ecology and animal behavior, and all the way through the revolutionary advancements in the technology of observation and the revolution in genetics and its role in the evolution of mankind and everything else on the planet. In much of that history, the bell was an active player, so that had to be included in the book. And then on top of that, you had this all this drama that went with the museum struggle just to survive within the university, and that was a struggle that mirrored in many ways the rise and fall and rise again of the whole science or the whole discipline of natural history. So it became quickly apparent that no one person is going to write that and do it justice, and certainly in the amount of time that we had, and in a 250-page book. So what we decided to do was divvy up the work, and we followed the plan a little bit, the original plan a little bit, where I would do the bulk of the writing from material that I got from my 3 colleagues, but also that those who were in best position to know the particular subject at hand would also provide drafts. And so we quickly enlisted in our that we brought on George Weibland, who is the the Bell's lead scientist, and Tim Whitfield with the Bell's herbarium to take on the story of the herbarium, and the planetarium's Sally Brummel to write the history of the planetarium. And the science, and well, regardless of who wrote the stories, the four of us would critique every story, and then the penultimate stop in this process was Gwen, who turns out to be a prodigious content editor, but a pretty fantastic copy editor. And the final stop was me. I would take everything and made sure that it read as if it came from one voice. One of the most difficult problems we had was trying to figure out or determine who and what to feature in this story, but also more pressing, what to leave out, because we would have to be leaving out most of everything. So we decided to concentrate on what was most significant in terms of people and events and research. What we wound up doing is for every story, or they're really story essays that we did, those stories would either feature and certainly lead with an individual who had made a significant contribution to the museum, or a program which had a profound effect in changing the direction and nature of the museum, and then or a kind of research that Bell Museum staff, scientific staff, had been involved in that significantly influenced the advancement of science in general. And the use of the photographs was to advance the story, because a lot of the stories are really, they need illustration, and we also had in that respect the services of Carrie Finkler, who is an accomplished designer, and she's really easy to work with, and so we're blessed in that. So you can jump into this book just about anywhere, and that's kind of the way the Bell Museum's exhibits go. There is a chronology, and it's there if you want to see it. We included a timeline that enables people to place whatever chapter they're reading about in that history, in that timeline. I gotta say that finally, that what we had going for us was I think Gwen has mentioned it, the fact that we knew each other. We have been friends and colleagues for a long time. And we've all worked together in one combination or another, in one capacity or another, but never on one project all together. So this was kind of a first for us, but we were prepared for it. Each of us knew the strengths and weaknesses and had enormous respect for the talents and expertise that we brought to this task. And lastly, we have all had very long associations with the Bell. Don has been with the Bell for a long time in one capacity or another, and involved in policies and the dramas that have gone on for nearly 50 years. That is almost 1/3 of the institution's existence. The last 1/3. It's his service has been pretty impressive. And it's not to say that we didn't have disagreements and vigorous debates about things, but in the end, we knew when to compromise. And I think at the end of the day, what we finally come up with is something that we're all pretty pleased with. So that's what I have to say.
Well, you should be pleased with it. It's a beautiful book and fascinating. I thought, I visited the museum years ago when I first moved to the Twin Cities, and I thought I had seen it, and I realize now I really hadn't. And it makes me want to go back and see the new building very much. So I congratulate you all on that. But you touched on one of my second question a little bit in your answer, and that is, can you give me some examples of what you had to leave out? Just maybe if given the complexity of things.
Sure, I'll respond to that. And our story of the Bell Museum is a collection of personal stories. We wanted to write a history that was engaging and intriguing. We all like a good story, and a story structured around a person or personality can be very compelling. So maybe first I'll talk just briefly about some of the personalities and examples of what we did include, and then I'll give you an example of something that we had to make the decision to leave out. So although in our book, the point of view of our stories is varied, it isn't always a personal story per se, but in all cases, an individual or individuals are integral to the narrative storytelling. So the main character in each story, and that is in each chapter, we have like about 42 chapters, and they're kind of long essays, but basically 42 stories. Sometimes a museum scientist, a museum educator of particular interest. Other times, the main character is an important scientific discovery or groundbreaking research with a museum connection. Other times, the main character is a museum educational program or approach that transformed scientific learning. Don talked about earlier about Dick Bartholomew and creating the touch and see room. But in all cases, each story is woven together with the accomplishments of an individual or group of individuals. For example, Dr. Harrison Tordoff was an ornithologist and also the director of the Bell Museum in the 1970s. He co-founded one of the nation's first successful reintroductions of an endangered species. In the early 1970s, the peregrine falcon was in danger of extinction from the impact of pesticide DDT. This story is told in the chapter titled Flight of the Peregrine, Bud Tordoff and the Return of an Endangered Species. The main character of this story is really the peregrine falcon, but behind this is the story of an individual with vision, perseverance, and scientific know-how that made this research endeavor successful. Now, another example of where the personal story is the story of Dr. Anna Pigeon in the chapter titled From Student Guide to College Professor. Anna was an undergraduate at the University of Minnesota and was hired as a tour guide at the museum in the early 1980s. After graduating, she returned to the Bell and was hired as a coordinator of the museum's student tour guides. And then a number of years later, she decided to leave the museum and get a PhD, and she's now a professor in avian ecology at the University of Wisconsin. She says that the Bell Museum had a profound impact on her life journey and career path. So importantly to know here is the Bell Museum is uniquely embedded with the university, giving the museum access to a huge pool of university students to work as interpretive tour guides and educators. But in turn, university students then have the opportunity to work closely with museum scientists and museum educators. So indeed, the Bell has had a profound impact on the life journey of many young university students. As a side note, I'm actually an example of that. I was a tour guide at the museum over 50 years ago in 1971, and went on to have a career in the environmental field. And I have to say that the Bell Museum had a big impact on my choices as to the work I did. So now back finally to your specific question. Okay, who did we leave out? What people did we leave out? Unfortunately, there are important individuals, many that aren't featured in the book. We had to make some hard decisions. One example I can think of would be a woman named Ruth Self, who was working at the Bell in the 1950s. Ruth is pictured in the book on page 62 with then director Walter Breckenridge. And she's in front of a museum diorama in that picture. But beyond that, we don't really say a lot about her. She was in the 50s kind of a woman of many talents. She was the secretary for the museum. She was the front lobby receptionist. And she was a talented fabricator of the realistic and taxonomically accurate plant models that are in the foreground of most of the museum's renowned dioramas. She was also co-author of one of the only other sort of histories of the Bell Museum, and that was the 1952 guidebook to the museum. Mm-hmm. So it would have been interesting to have interviewed her and gotten her perspective on the daily workings of the museum in the 1950s. But Ruth was in her mid-90s and living in Pennsylvania as we were writing the books. And it just wasn't practical. She actually died recently at the age of 98. So I could go on, but these are examples that provide you with insight into how we structured the writing of 150 years of history of the Bell Museum. Thanks. Good question.
Oh, thank you. Again, congratulations to all of you on producing such a really fine book, and it's a very attractive book as well. I think I'll go on now to Beth Dooley and the Steger Homestead Kitchen. My first question for you, Beth, is in reading the introduction, stories, and recipes, and trying a few of them as well, it struck me how much modern American society takes food for granted, both its source and preparation. Any thoughts on how we can overcome this tendency?
Just look around you. You know, one of the really fun things about going out in the woods with Will is that you realize how much food you're stepping on every time you walk out your front door. You know, and I remember we were testing a recipe that included juniper berries, and I said to Rita Mae, so should I run to the co-op and get some juniper berries? And she said, well, there's some right in the hedge on your the border of your lawn, right? So, I think it's another wake-up call to pay attention to our natural world and realize how abundant this real area is. One of the things about Will is that he's become something of a national icon, but I think many people who live in other parts of the country don't realize that he is a Minnesotan. He's a born and bred Minnesotan with a great big heart that loves Minnesota, loves this area, and has worked really hard to put it on a map in a lot of ways. So again, by telling his story, it's a very intimate story, and telling stories that really cast a light on not only his work, but who he is as a person. I think a lot of people resonate with that, especially younger people. I know my sons are, consider him a huge hero and embrace many of his values that are quite different, frankly, from the generation I grew up in. So it's interesting because he's of my generation, but he seems to be really appealing to people of younger generations. So he's kind of timeless in that way.
Yeah, I was kind of surprised reading his essays about his background in education. I had not realized that.
Yeah.
And it sort of shows through as you read through the book.
It does. And he loves that. I mean, he's really about, engagement and how important those engagement of our senses is to how we learn things. So he's really a model of experiential learning. And it's exciting because when you see him around groups of kids, he models that for him. He loves nothing better than that.
Sure.
And one of the great stories, not to go on too much, but one of the great stories in the book is about how when he began working with dogs, he has a wonderful, almost intuitive ability to connect with dogs. And when he began engaging dogs for his expeditions, one of his friends who taught in the same school that Will taught in St. Paul, grew up on a farm, knew animals really well. He became the vet that then moved up to the homestead and began, working with Will to breed those dogs. And then those dogs would pup underneath this guy's porch. He built his own cabin, and then he became the vet for the dogs. So really,
wow, that's cool.
Yeah. So it's full of those kinds of stories too that really bring both Will and the place alive.
Thanks. Another question, it's a pretty obvious one, is do you have a favorite recipe or favorite recipes?
Do I have a favorite child? I mean, kind of not fair. No, I love them all. I think one of my favorite recipes is, there's several of them that include morels, because another character in the book, real person, is the photographer, John Ratzlaff, who's a good friend of Will's and who has documented a lot of the work that Will's done up in Ely. And we go out every once in a while with John and hunt those morels when they're in season. They're coming now, and it's terribly exciting. And so there's nothing better than eating those morels in a saute pan in the woods over a fire with a lot of butter, right? And so there's a recipe for that, and there's also photos of that. Thanks,
right.
John. Yeah.
All right, thank you very much. Now moving on to Karen Cooper. When Minnehaha flowed with whiskey. My first question to you is, since I've done some research myself in the same physical region, I know that good locations for saloons and dance halls certainly existed in other areas around the Minneapolis and along the river, like places like Rumtown, which you mentioned in your book. So why was Minnehaha such a magnet for this activity?
I think it was such a magnet because it was first. It's the closest beauty spot to the fort, and the fort, of course, was the first European American bastion of, moving into this land and having, white people come here. And that goes all the way back to the beginning of the 1800s. So even in the earliest descriptions of the fort, they would talk about going to a picnic, going to see the little waterfall, the Little Falls, Browns Falls. And so that was kind of a revered place. I mean, Charlotte, Wisconsin, Van Cleve talked
Right.
about it, right? In years later, when how it had been so beautiful and picking flowers and all of that. So it was first. It was close to the forts. It was close to people. It was easy to get to. There were lots of other places, as you say, where there was equally rowdy behavior. Rumtown was in 1837, and that was just a couple of years after the St. Croix pineries were available to be cut after that treaty. And there was no settlers allowed anywhere on the military reservation except in the immediate vicinity of the fort at that time. And so once that one little door was cracked open, Joseph Brown said, I'm going to set up this little watering hole. And I think it was in part response to the fact that the military had provided rations of alcohol to their men for years and years, since the beginning of time, probably. And I think it was 1836 when the government said, you know what, everybody's just too drunk all the time, and they stopped the ration. But that doesn't mean people didn't want it. So the men then responded pretty well to having Rumtown within rifle shot of the fort, as Dr. Emerson called it. They said, it's right there. We're going to take full advantage of that. That was just kind of an isolated example. I guess Pig's Eye Perron down the way in Fountain Cave also would be another local example. Farther away and downriver, you had to have a boat to get there pretty much. But as time went on, as the decades went on, as settlement occurred, as the towns began to grow, as people really showed up and stayed, there were other places. The foot of the new bridge across from the fort to the St. Paul side, which went in I've forgotten the year, 1911, 1917, something like that, after the streetcar in 1905.
Right.
Yeah. And that was George Hansen's St. Paul Hotel or Fort Snelling Hotel or something. That place was well known for dissipated women and rowdy behavior and drinking and so on. There was also like chicken shacks along the north shore of the lake we call Bide Makaska. There was one of my pavilion keepers was a man named Powdler. He had another operation along the shores of Lake Amelia, now called Nokomis. And so that was really available, but Minnehaha was important because it was there, it was first, and it was famous.
Yeah.
And the poem, of course, made that worldwide famous. It gave name to everything in Minnesota, it seemed, or everything in the Twin Cities, right? Streets, schools, houses, all of it's named for words from that poem. And so those things kind of combined, I think, to make that like the go-to place. Also, there was transportation. It was easy to get to the streetcars and the motor line and the roads went in pretty quickly. So it all combined, I think, to make that the go-to place. Not the only one, but for sure the most famous.
Yeah. Yeah, I was also impressed by the way your book sort of describes the social and political conflicts around Minnehaha Park, which, were you surprised that the creation of a public park could generate so much controversy?
Yes. Yes, I really was. I was surprised by several of the things that happened along the way. For instance, it took 4 years to create the park. And the original statute was, we're going to have a state park and it's going to be at Minnehaha Falls. Why would that take 4 years, right? We know where it's going to be. We're not looking for a spot. It's going to be at Minnehaha. And the short answer to that is that the legislature only appropriates money every 2 years. That's always been true. So they had to keep waiting for a new appropriation year, and then they didn't get the appropriation. The other thing that really made this a kind of a complicated story to tell was all the lawsuits. People sued all the way to the Supreme Court on multiple occasions. Every landowner sued the park board, every single one of them. Every lessee who could get their hands on a lawyer sued and sued and sued because they wanted to they wanted to keep the land. They had owned it for a very long time. In one case, this woman's children were born there. She'd lived there for most of her adult life. She wanted to keep the fame, the fortune, and her hotel going as long as possible. And so she sued, and then after the park board legally took her land away and she had to sign the title, she sued again. I mean, there's just no end to the energy people put into keeping Minnehaha from becoming a park. And that's in contrast to during the same 4-year period, people are donating land to the park board. All of what used to be 48th Street, it's now East Minnehaha Parkway, that was donated. People just said, you guys want a parkway? That sounds good. Let's do that. Here, take my land. And much of the shore of Lake Harriet was donated as well. People just said, yes, the park system seems great. We're all in favor. Let me contribute in my own way.
Wow.
But at Minnehaha, it was all lawsuits, every single bit of it. And it's because it was famous, it was revered, it was important, it was a source of income, it was fun. And yeah, so people just sued. Yeah.
I also want to say, I would love to get together with you sometime and just talk about Franklin Steele.
Oh, could we please? I
yeah,
really wanted
it's
to ask for that too. I really want that conversation.
Yeah, he's a remarkable man and appalling as well. So thank you very much.
100%. Yeah, I would love that. Let's do it.
All right. And finally, I don't mean for you to be totally last, Virginia Wright-Peterson, but unfortunately, you're just happened to fall that way. Thank you for your patience. Now on to Rochester and urban biography. I want to ask why you decided to adopt a somewhat unusual approach in your book, weaving stories of people, places, and events, as opposed to doing a straight chronological narrative, like you see in a lot of these sort of city histories.
Sure. Well, first, no problem about being last. With a last name that starts with W, I'm to it. My birth name is Peterson, but when I got married, then all of a sudden I got shifted to the end of everything. That's fine. Yeah, great question. Rochester and Urban Biography is actually my third book. So I wrote the Women of Mayo Clinic, the Founding Generation, and then Women's War II, Women During World War II. And I've found in all of these that I really like to focus on the people and the themes and not be limited by a straight chronology year by year. And I think a few examples from the Rochester and Urban Biography and why this works, I think better than just year by year, is I'm able to sort of jump in and handle a topic in a way that becomes, I think, more powerful when it's told all together. I mean, the overall chronology of the book is there. It starts in the 1850s and it ends with the very recent days, COVID and things like that. So that overarching chronology is there. But then within that, one example I can give is an IBM plant opened here in the 1950s and is still here in a smaller form. Now, if I had told the story of the IBM plant from beginning in the 1850s and then just kept bringing it up every time there was a transition or change in it, it would have been so fragmented that the real impact of the presence of IBM and that plant and the people that work there would really get, I think, lost. So that's one of the examples. I think another is racism is a theme throughout the book, an issue. And it does pop up somewhat throughout, but I really focus on it on 2 or 3 chapters. And I think that helps understand the impact a little bit more than an incident here, an incident there. Sometimes the cumulative impact of incidents.
And I think you brought some immediacy to it with some of your own memories. I thought that was a nice touch.
Thank you. If I could, that is another unusual aspect to the book that people comment on. And it is really important to me that rather than trying to treat my view of Rochester's history very objectively, the fact that I've lived here my entire life and my grandchildren are the 7th generation of our family to be here, it seemed to be important to say, this is my perspective and my lens. And even though I'm using facts from archives and things, not 200 boxes, my gosh, like those of you at the Bell Museum, but I'm relying on sources. I'm still making decisions, editorial decisions, like what is in, what gets into the book, what's left out. And I really wanted people to understand there's a human being but kind of behind this. And I wanted people to be able to, again, identify with me and start looking at their own places, whether it's the hometown or where you're living now, with maybe a new perspective.
Sure. It also occurred to me too, reading your book, that sometimes a singular event can really have a tremendous, long-lasting impact on a community. And would you say the August 1883 tornado was such an event for Rochester?
Sure, the devastation caused by that tornado did hatch, if you will, the Mayo Clinic. But the combined collaboration of the Sisters of St. Francis and ultimately the Mayo brothers and the father, who are actually sort of reluctant in the beginning. Thank goodness for the vision of Mother Alfred and the Sisters of St. Francis. But I think our attraction to some of these disasters, even as a society, it's not that event itself, right? But again, what it cracks open and how people respond, and who makes the bold action, takes the bold steps, and what downstream impacts does that have? And again, I think it's part of this creating a narrative that ends up masking a lot of other narratives. Right. At the same time, a lot more has happened in Rochester, but we keep going back to that origination story of the 1883 tornado.
Well, I think for a lot of communities too, it's the Dakota War of 1862, or other events like that. But it really struck me with just the way the community was physically devastated as well. I think it was like an F4 tornado. It was really quite severe. But well, thanks so much for being with us today, and thanks to all of you. It's been a great pleasure. I've enjoyed this discussion immensely. And I think for those of you who are listening, if you enjoyed this talk, you can find a treasure trove of past events archived on the YouTube channel, the Minnesota Book Awards Steward Organization, the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library. You can find out more about future programs on their website, thefriends.org. In particular, mark your calendars for Tuesday, May 2nd. I look forward to meeting all of you there at the Ordway Center in St. Paul for the book awards. Tickets are just $22 for you and the public. And you can visit friends.org/MNBA for details. Well, goodbye and best wishes to everyone and good luck. I look forward to seeing you on May 2nd.